It's a familiar scene. People gathering to enjoy conversation and a drink, often the kind with alcohol. More than half of Texas adults drink alcohol at least occasionally, according to the latest data from the Department of State Health Services. But turn back the clock 90 years, and you reach a time when drinking alcohol meant breaking the law. Here in 1920s Galveston and everywhere else in the U.S.
It's hard for us to imagine, looking back on that era, how dramatic that people that supported Prohibition thought that the elimination of alcohol would be. That this would really make an enormous difference in the larger health, physical, moral, economic of the entire country.
That belief led to a nationwide ban on the sale and manufacture of alcohol, one that lasted from 1920 to 1933. The outlines of that era are familiar from history books and popular culture. But what's the story of Prohibition here in Texas before 1920 and in the years that followed?
Starting in the 1870s, Texas had introduced laws that made it possible, county by county, to impose prohibition or other kinds of severe limitations on the consumption of alcohol. So as the United States moved closer and closer to formal prohibition, Texas was becoming drier and drier. As you might expect, it was the rural counties that led the way, at least those that were in the eastern and northern part of the state. And it was those counties in the most urban areas and along the border that resisted the temptation to get rid of strong drink.
Even in wet cities like El Paso, public opinion was deeply divided.
Here, as in every city and county across the United States and in Texas, there was an active temperance movement and a large number of people involved in pushing the cause of temperance. And they developed sufficient support so that in January of 1918, a referendum was scheduled and held on the question of whether alcohol would be banned in the city and county. And this vote did not succeed by the smallest of margins, about 150 voters or so. Because of that margin, El Paso turned down Prohibition. This was very significant in kind of larger political terms, but also, of course, was a strong sign of how the city itself and the county and the surrounding areas would deal with national prohibition when it came into force.
Then, 8 months before national prohibition began, Texas voters passed a statewide ban with 53% approval. The new laws changed little about life in dry towns, but in formerly wet areas, local breweries closed, speakeasies opened, and drinking moved underground.
The consumption of alcohol did come down, obviously, but many people continued to participate, except that they were driven underground, they were criminalized, and the industry continued, except that it became quite unsafe, and people died. So in that sense, it's not that different from the drug business today.
Every Texas town has its stories. In Houston, in the summer of 1927, authorities seized a 600-gallon still from a house on Westheimer Road. A Dallas police officer is still honored for dying after a raid that same year. And in Galveston, with easy access to the coast, gangs of local rum runners made alcohol easy to find. But it was here on the Texas-Mexico border where Prohibition brought the greatest change.
Once alcohol was forbidden in El Paso, people in El Paso didn't have to produce the alcohol. People in El Paso didn't have to go into criminal activity. They simply crossed the border. And the vice industry in Juarez flourished. This is a multifold multiplication of Americans simply crossing the border conveniently to get drunk.
Soon, the border became a draw for tourists from across the U.S.
All the Texas border counties became those places where people would essentially travel down south. And Texas politicians and businesses participated. Look, El Paso Chamber of Commerce, for example, in the 1920s, found ways to promote these tours to Mexico. But they were drinking tours. And Juarez like Tijuana and like other Mexican towns, became essentially the places to go and play. It was the Roaring Twenties, and Juarez participating in the Roaring Twenties. And the bases were established and cemented in Juarez for an illegal industry to supply the vice habits of Americans, and it hasn't changed since.
The manufacture of alcohol boomed in Juarez, with American distillers relocating to Mexico and new producers opening shop.
Production facilities develop with a goal to providing for people who are crossing the border to consume, but also, of course, with the full understanding that a fair proportion of what's produced is going to be smuggled into the United States.
That alcohol made its way deep into the U.S., bringing both profits and violence to the border. Then in 1933, our nation's experiment with prohibition ended, and control over alcohol was given back to each state.
Some states actually maintained prohibition for some time, even into the 1940s. And many states maintained a local option approach, and that's exactly what happened in Texas.
In some Texas counties, legal alcohol returned quickly. In others, restrictions remain to this day. And just across our border, a very different legacy of prohibition remains.
The current drug war has deep roots in the history of Mexico and Mexico's relationship to the United States. Mexico has provided illegal substances to American consumers for about 100 years, and Americans have sought illegal substances in Mexico.
The basis for organized crime, the experience, the learning curve on the business of illegality, on the business of black market, on the networks to carry out these activities were set in by alcohol. So some of these networks actually survived the Prohibition era and continued and moved into the business of prostitution and drugs and other things. So they're not unrelated events. It's a 90-year continuum of the same problem.
One of those survivors was a woman known as La Nacha, a former bootlegger arrested for drug trafficking during World War II.
Mexico refused to extradite her. So what they did in concession was agreed to keep her in prison for the duration of the war, whatever that would be. When she was released, she eventually returned to Juarez and actually expanded her business into this whole region. She never was a trafficker along the grounds of like Lucky Luciano, but she was, for this region and area, she was the significant trafficker and either the dominant or one of the dominants. What's most interesting to me is that she was never killed.
Profits and violence have grown dramatically here since La Nacha's time. Trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and according to Mexico's government, there's an intense human cost. More than 30,000 people killed in drug-related violence since 2006. It's very rare for that violence to cross into this country, but the flow of illegal drugs and the question of how we respond raise huge issues on our side of the border.
The U.S. government is putting a lot of pressure on Mexico to fight these cartels and to stem the tide of drugs into the United States. And a lot of that has also produced tens of thousands of bodies. So we are intimately connected with that, just as we were intimately connected in the Prohibition era. So we are responsible. I think we ought to begin to look at the whole chain and the role that we play. Even though the bodies may not be on this side of the border, we have to begin to look at the role that we play in creating that violence on the side and to begin to question our own policies.
Some experts believe our policies today might benefit from a look at the past.
Those of us who study the war on drugs, who study prohibition, who study the different market forces at work are beginning to say, wait a minute, are we doing the right thing? Are we not making the same mistakes? And it doesn't seem to me that is uncivil. It may have become somewhat uncivilized or somewhat heated in the 1920s, for example, especially towards the early 1930s, and the experiment was failed. I think that the debate is changing, and it is changing in some very interesting ways.
It's a debate these people might find familiar, one with deep roots in our past, and tough questions for all of us today.